Maybe the quietest spot you could pick to have an interview. Because anywhere else, if you go over to Space Center Houston, it's always a rumble in a building or kids going by or an airplane flying over. This is a pretty quiet place.
When Gail and I were setting this up, it was either set up where there's going to be a lot of people and doing a tour, or I really tried to push for a place that had a lot of history behind it. And so I'm glad that we were able to get here.
Great help.
Absolutely. And just to kind of start off the interview, what does flying mean to you? Is it an emotion? Is it a state of being? What is flight?
Flying to me, I guess, from my early days in life, has been a passion. Naval aviation particularly has been my life, all my life. When I was a young kid, I go back to World War II, and I was just a young 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, and like other kids, I had a dream, and I made model airplanes, and my dream was someday to fly. And I'd watch all those movie tone news, and believe it or not, to today's present generation, we didn't have television. I know that's hard to accept and hard to understand. So, you go to the movies once a week, see the newsreels of what was happening during the war, particularly in the Pacific, and I was watching some of those unsung heroes of their time who are now icons of aviation history in this country make airplanes literally do the impossible. Anonymous heroes in my life, some of whom I've had the privilege of beginning to know, are the ones that inspired me to dream about flying, particularly off of aircraft carriers. And I carried that dream with me all during my childhood days and through Naval ROTC in college. I think what's interesting, though, and I try and convey this to kids, my dad had a dream at that point in time, too. And his dream was for me to get the education that he never had the opportunity in his lifetime to get. And those dreams came together when I graduated college, when I graduated Purdue, because I had an engineering degree in one hand and orders to Pensacola in the other hand. And from there on, my life became a fairy tale. I lived my dream of flying off of aircraft carriers, which was literally an impossible dream as a kid. Drew blue collar family, knew I'd never get a chance to fly. And and that dream, in addition, led me from the flight deck of a carrier to the surface of the moon. Truly a fairy tale.
Now, you talked about your time at Purdue, and you have a Bachelor of Science from there. But why was it because of the films and the news reels that you were seeing as a kid that drove you to the Navy, or why not the Army, because they were flying at the same time?
There was only one kind of flying I wanted to do. When you try and, in my lifetime, describe flight, it was off an aircraft carrier. Don't ask me why. It was just the inspiration, and that's what I wanted to do. And that was it. That was my desire. That was my dream. And by golly, that's what I was going to do. And as I say, the rest is history.
Now, when you were actually going through flight school and learning how to land and take off on carriers, it was still in the developing stages, not even close to where it is now. How did that make you feel, knowing that you're...
Well, I guess, let me say this about naval aviation and its impact on America's space program. Not that naval aviators are any better than anybody else. It's just, I think, our training and our attitude and our passion and how we are trained does have a significance, because the first American in space was a naval aviator. The first American to orbit the Earth wore Navy wings of gold. the first man and the last man to step foot on the surface of the moon were naval aviators. 5 out of 6 lunar landings were commanded by naval aviators, as well as Apollo 13 that didn't have the opportunity to land. And I think the reason for that goes back to those early days where we did prepare to land aboard an aircraft carrier, where you didn't take anything for granted, and you had your destiny in your own hands. I remember my very first solo flight, and I looked over my shoulder and there was nobody there. And I've always said, when you come aboard an aircraft carrier in a jet airplane at night, there's nothing, even landing on the moon, that can compare to that, because it's only you and your maker. And if you are not in control of your destiny, if you don't make it happen, it ain't going to happen. And I think that carries over to the challenges that we had, that training, that background as naval aviators, to the challenges that we had and the commitment we made to be the best. Because in carrier aviation, if you don't plan on being the best, then you're in the wrong job. Because anything less than the best is not good enough.
To kind of touch on your first solo flight and all that, what was your training like? How arduous was it? And when the training wheels were off, how hard was it?
Well, flying, for me, I first started out in a T-34 and then went to a T-28 before I ever got in jets. And I think my education, I think my engineering background, which the thing I've always said about college, you go to college to learn how to learn. And then I had the fundamental of a engineer and a technical background to work on. That made me a far better pilot. And flying actually came very easy. It was a very natural thing for me to do. So when it came time for that first solo, all of a sudden you realize that you're up there alone and you've done it. You can do it. My dad always used to tell me as a kid, and I try and relate this to other young men and women, just go out and do your best. No matter what you do, whether it's in a classroom, on a football field, and I carry that on into flying. Just go out and do your best. Your best isn't going to be better than everybody else's, but someday you're going to surprise yourself. How right he was. And that's all I did all my life. And my best wasn't necessarily as good as everybody else's in everything. But flying was one of those things that was very comforting. I was at home in. And every day, to this day, I'm still flying. I've still got my own airplane. I'm still flying a lot of high performance aircraft as well. And every day, I learn something new. Every day, flying teaches me something new about flying and about myself and about my own capabilities. And I think it takes commitment, dedication, and most important, you have to have the passion for what you're doing. And if you don't have that passion, then I've always said, you're in the wrong business.
Now, you've been behind sticks of countless airplanes and aircraft, and you touched base on one of them, the T-28, and you also flew the A4 and some other, and countless others. What are some of the things that you remember most about those aircraft, or what's something that you would like the younger generation to know about those older craft?
Well, I haven't had a chance to fly many World War II airplanes. There's a lot of them I would like to have flown, and maybe the closest thing I ever came to that was the old T-28, the Navy version, not the Air Force. The Navy had a much higher powered version, and also had a T-28 Charlie, which had a tail hook, and which the tail hook differentiates naval aviators from most everybody else. And I love that airplane, big old rotary engine, and you sit at the end of the runway, ka-clunk, ka-clunk, ka-clunk. Now, that's not to say I don't and haven't enjoyed flying jet aircraft, because that's where you can make airplanes do things that are just incredible. Made 2 cruises in a little old Skyhawk A4, on the old small 27 Charlie carriers. Made a cruise on a Shangri-La and a Hancock. And in those days, we had a sort of a dual mission. We had to be able to fight a conventional war if one broke out. But if one wants to look back in history, those were the real Cold War days, where we were, in effect, at war with the Soviet Union without ever dropping bombs on each other, only because we could carry what we called a big bomb. And in A4s, and I made 2 cruises to the Western Pacific, we were trained at what could have been one-way missions. Because if war broke out, if something big time happened, we were to launch off those carriers with a big bomb. We had targets up and down throughout Asia, from Vladivostok down to Hainan Island in China. And we were ready to do our job, not knowing that the carrier would be there when we got back. You know, I don't mean to overblow that, but that was a commitment we made. And the fact that we were capable of doing what I just described is probably one of the reasons that there was a stalemate during the Cold War, is because we could do that to each other and no one wanted to make that happen. Unfortunately, the world's a little more unstable today because we got some really radical people out there where logic doesn't apply. It did back then during the 60s.
So your time on the carriers, yeah, everybody always thinks you have the ship crew and then you have the squadron. What was it like, and how close were you to the other pilots while you're on the carrier?
Well, we had I think 4 squadrons on one of my cruises and 5 squadrons on another, you know, roughly 15 airplanes, 12 airplanes, 15, 18 pilots. And we got to know each other pretty well because the LSOs, landing signal officers, came from different squadrons. And, you know, you get to know each other. You get to, we were at sea I made a 11-month cruise, and that's a long time to be away from home. Not that you're not in port a lot, but in a 9.5, 10-month cruise, you get to know the people. You get to know ship's company. You know, let's face it, you put a lot of faith in you don't do it alone. I've always said in the space program, we were the tip of the arrow. There's thousands of other people who committed themselves to getting us to the moon. It's the same thing aboard ship. You know, when you're on a catapult at night, there's a lot of those young enlisted men, yellow shirts, green shirts, white shirts out there on the flight deck in 40 knots of wind that are probably in more danger than you are, quite frankly. But when you get ready to go on that catapult and you salute, or you turn on the lights, particularly at night, salute the catapult officer, you know, you've got a faith in a lot of other people to do their job. People are empowered from the seaman first class, airman first class, all the way up to the guy in the cockpit of that airplane to do their job. And if anyone along the way is not committed, again, to do the best that he possibly can, your life is in jeopardy. So you become very good friends with a lot of the people. You intermingle for that length of time. Certainly your squadron, you know, starts with your squadron mates, and then enlisted men in your squadron, and expands to the air group, and from the air group it expands to the ship's company, and it's almost one big happy family. I'm not going to say, you know, the 3,000 or 4,000 men and women aboard. Well, there were no women at that point in time. The men aboard ship, but you did develop a lot of faith in what they were doing.
So it almost sounds like that the Navy was the perfect tie-in to what NASA was just getting off the ground back in the very late 50s, early 60s. Does Navy life really translate over to NASA that well?
Well, I don't know whether Navy life was that closely related to the life we led in the space program, but the astronauts were, we all worked together. We had some of us flew together. We had to depend upon each other and what happened in the flights. And And we got very close. We were all of us who were in the Air Force, Marines, Navy, Coast Guard, or wherever in that time in the space program. The respect for rank and experience was certainly there. But we took off our uniforms except for special occasions and funerals. And unfortunately, I remember one time in a 2-year period of time, we wore our uniforms 8 times. And it was not for special awards. It was a fact that we lost people along the way. But other than that, we were in civilian clothes. And, you know, not that I didn't respect and call Alan Shepard sir every now and then. And when I was a neophyte, when I was a nugget in the space program, and I was walking the halls with Alan Shepard and John Glenn and Gus Grissom and the original 7 and some of the 9 guys that preceded us, I will tell you, I certainly respected who they were from a traditional military point of view, but just from a respect of what they had done. But the program was the kind that you had to, I got assigned as Alan Shepard's backup on Apollo 14, backup commander. And I'll never forget, and we became, prior to that, I never really knew Alan very well. And after those 2 years of training and working with him, he became one of my best friends. You know, certainly far senior to me in terms of experience and rank and what have you. We became very, very dear friends, and I found myself the night before he launched to the moon on Apollo 14, being his backup. The tradition was to go out to the pad the night before and look at that big monster Saturn V, the same vehicle I called my mistress on Apollo 17, and that's what it was. And just think for a while. And I remember that moment very vividly. We didn't say too much to each other, but here he was after his first flight, 10 years later, getting command of a mission to the moon. And as backup to Alan Shepard, I knew at that point in time I'd never fly. He'd have to break both legs before I could ever fly. But we stood there, and I had to stand there as his equal. And not only did I stand there as his equal, I had already flown twice, walked in space, and been to the moon, and he still only had 16 minutes of space flight experience. And I'll never forget that moment, because 10 years earlier, I was just a young naval aviator, not even in the space program, watching and revered this American hero, Alan Shepard, who was going up on a rocket in a suborbital space. Fate plays many tricks, and I say that to young men and young women, particularly in the service. Never count yourself out. You just never know what life is really in store for you. There's certain moments in my days that I cannot forget, and I just cannot say enough what a role naval aviation has played in my life. All my life, even today. I'm very much involved with the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation in Pensacola, very much involved with the National Flight Academy that we've worked on and established down there in Pensacola, which is an unbelievable, and anyone who hasn't been down there, anyone involved in naval aviation needs to see what's going down there, because it's built around science and engineering, math, and young kids, using aviation, particularly naval aviation, which tends to be a cut above in excitement. When you watch the Blues, when you watch Top Gun, when you see those kind of things, you know, your blood starts churning in your body. Using it as the hook, get kids' attention, and make learning fun. You can teach them anything, and that's what it's about. And that's why I'm still so much involved in what the Navy is doing. And here we are in the centennial year, 100 years of naval aviation, and who knows what the next 100 years will bring.
You kind of touched on it a little bit, but what were some of the similarities and differences between a flight squadron and the astronaut corps?
Probably not a great deal of difference between our squadron aboard ship and the astronaut corps. Maybe a little less, I won't say discipline, but a little less military formal kind of thing. And you know, in a squadron, we all worked with all the enlisted men who were supporting what we were doing. And we didn't have that enlisted contingent. We had NASA employees working and supporting us. What was interesting at that point in time, most of our support people, the people once you got a flight, you would have 10 or 12 people who were supporting you from the mission planning point of view, from the technical point of view, from the suiting point of view. But they were almost all of those people at that point in time had some kind of military background. Some were still active duty military like we were. See, all the whole time I was with NASA, 13 years I spent with NASA, I was still a naval aviator. I was still paid by the Navy. Nothing changed except this was temporary duty, renewed every 2 years, quite honestly. And so we were surrounded by a lot of people who had that military environment in which they had been in one way or another. So we all sort of had that same culture, that same discipline. When given a job, by golly, we were going to get it done. And we had tremendous support from those people around us, very much like shipboard, where we had truly tremendous support from the enlisted personnel who were taking care of our airplanes and working with us, helping us design our missions aboard ship as they were helping us design our missions to go to the moon. It's just part of the natural atmosphere, environment.
Yeah. Many people associate you with Apollo 17, and some may not understand that you were up in Apollo 10, which was pretty much a complete dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. What was it like knowing that you were going to be getting so close and not there yet, but at the same time making all the preparations for fellow crewmates to be able to make that giant leap?
Well, my first flight, of course, was Gemini 9, where we're trying to learn how to rendezvous and see if we could work outside a spacecraft. And being the second American to walk in space at that point in time, I think I explained it very well in my book. We knew nothing about what we were doing, quite honestly. And then came Apollo 10. As we progressed, got over the tragedy of the Apollo 1 fire, and that's a whole nother story, but we did essentially rise out of the ashes to fulfill John Kennedy's commitment about getting to the moon by the end of the decade. Now, things changed along the way. You know, people weren't picked to do certain things, to be the first on the moon or last. It's just people were picked to fly a mission, do your job, and we'll see how we get there. At one time, actually, Apollo 10 was in line to be the first landing. And Tom Stafford could have been the first man on the moon, and that would have been perfectly fine, and I would have been the second, and that would have been perfectly fine. In retrospect, quite frankly, I'm sort of glad the way it worked out the way it did, because Apollo 17 was a whole other story. But our mission eventually was to go ahead and do everything Apollo 11 was supposed to do. Go down to 8 miles above the surface, 47,000 feet, test the radar, test the landing gear, do the rendezvous, separate the spacecraft, separate them in space the way they would separate on the surface of the moon, just make sure everything worked. I tell Neil Armstrong that we painted the white line in the sky so we wouldn't get lost. He's heard that from me enough where he's beginning to believe it, I think. But I'll tell you one thing, when we went over, we made 2 passes over the landing site, and I tell you what, I think I said things that, boy, we are down among them. I felt like I had to pick up my feet to keep from dragging on top of the mountains. I mean, we were close, and we're going over those hills at 3,000 miles an hour. So you can just imagine what that was like, and it was one of those quick touch and goes. We didn't have a chance to put our tail hook down to stay, but and that would have been the big part of the challenge. Nonetheless, we were only the second flight to go to the moon, the first to take the lunar module, and it was the right decision to be made to get everything done. And we found some problems that had we attempted to land might have kept us from landing, and then paved the way for Apollo 11 to go ahead and successfully land. So it was a right decision at the right time.
During Apollo 10 or during the Gemini mission, is there any given time, was there something that went wrong or absolutely right that really helped because of your military training?
Oh, I think my military training, along with my education, contributed significantly to whatever I was able to accomplish. Gemini 9, when I had all kinds of trouble on that spacewalk because we didn't anticipate, oddly enough, the laws of Newton and zero gravity, got me in a great deal of trouble. I've called that 2.5 hours in space outside the spacecraft spacewalk from hell, and it was. We managed to end it successfully in that, even though I didn't accomplish what I was to accomplish on that mission, we learned a lot. We learned about what we didn't know, and that carried us through. Dealing on Apollo 10, I was a junior man on a crew. I certainly respected Tom Stafford and John Young. We worked together. We knew what our jobs were. I just think the discipline and the commitment you grow up in as a naval aviator it played a significant role all through my life. And of course, the one thing I wanted more than anything else after I had those first 2 flights is the thing I gave up when I left the active Navy, and that was command of my own squadron. That was my goal. I was in postgraduate school when I was selected for the space program. I wasn't qualified. I didn't have enough jet time, and I hadn't yet gone to test pilot school. And I didn't volunteer because I didn't think I was qualified. And lo and behold, I got a call from the Navy Department, said they wanted to recommend me to NASA for further evaluation. And 2 or 3, 4 months later, and after confronting about 400 of the top aviators that this country could put together in one room down in a Rice Hotel here, old Rice Hotel here in Houston, Texas, 400 of them, they broke a altitude record or a speed record, combat experience, and me. After about 3 or 4 months of back and forth, I was one of 14 selected. People say, how did I get selected? And to this day, I don't yet know why, except I had the determination and commitment as to me at that time an underdog to do something that not many people had an opportunity to do. And so when it came after Apollo 10, long story and I won't go into it, but I turned on an opportunity to walk on the moon on Apollo 16, would have been Apollo 16, to take my chance on getting my command. I didn't want to get a command to give orders. I wanted the responsibility. I wanted to have the opportunity to prove that I was good enough to command a squadron, which I couldn't do anymore because I was no longer in that part of the Navy. My squadron was my crew. My squadron was our support team around us. And the responsibility and the challenge I had was to successfully complete probably the most ambitious, and it should have been, mission of the Apollo program, because we were the final flight. We landed in a mountainous area. We landed in a northeastern corner, which put a demand on the dynamics of our flight. We stayed there longer, and I relished that opportunity. And, you know, like my dad said a long time ago, just do your best and someday you may surprise yourself. And I was not going to disappoint him.
Now, going back to Gemini 9 real quick. Of course, you were the second EVA behind Ed White. And you were stranded out there for, as you said, 2.5 hours. Traditionally, pilots go through some form of survival training during their training to become a pilot. At any given time during that EVA, did any of that come back to you?
Yeah, during that Gemini EVA, a lot of things came back to me. And, you know, our survival training in the jungle and in the ocean and the desert, this was a little different environment. But the determination to not give up, the determination to not give in to the environment that I was confronted with during that walk is probably what saved my life. I was not going to let this get to me. You know, a lot of problems happened. My visor got all fogged up. I ripped my suit on the inside and back. We knew getting back in the spacecraft. I've always compared it to trying to put a champagne cork back into a champagne bottle. I was a cork and the spacecraft was a bottle. We knew it was going to be difficult. We practiced it a lot, but we never had an opportunity to really practice it in an extended period of time in zero gravity because you can't reproduce it on Earth. I knew that was going to be a problem, but I put that off until the end because I had enough problems where I was. And yes, it crossed my mind. Well, it crossed my mind that it might be difficult to get back in, but I never, ever accepted the fact that I wasn't going to complete this mission with some degree of success and come home with something and yet get back in a spacecraft. But finally getting in that spacecraft was the real ordeal. But as far as the survival training, yes, I was in a survival mode, and I was not going to give in to the enemy. And the enemy at that point in time was my environment. My spacesuit was like plaster of Paris. It was hard to bend. The zero G was certainly, you know, people see astronauts floating around zero G, oh, how wonderful it is. Zero G was the enemy. And time was the enemy. Daylight, darkness. I had to confront all those things, and I was not going to give in. And in this particular case, I was a rookie, okay? I had to prove something to somebody that I was good enough. And I guess that gave me the motivation, that gave me the determination that I was coming home. And I guess that's, you know, there's a lot of stories about those who survived in the jungle of Vietnam. And I've got to believe that their thinking and my thinking was the same.
Now, during that EVA, and a lot of data was recorded, and your experiences helped pave the way towards the Apollo missions and EVAs on the moon, as well as what they're doing now or what they were doing with the shuttle. How does it feel knowing that you helped develop techniques that have helped NASA for over 40, 50 years?
Well, you never discover how much you don't know until you give it a try. We didn't know what we didn't know at the time I walked in space on that EVA. And today, on a station or on shuttle, or yesterday on shuttle, unfortunately, they do it with ease. And they, you know, we discovered that if you can anchor your feet, and I had no place to put my feet. You know, how dumb can we be? We had smart engineers in the program, and I was going to do it. I should have thought about some of these things. In zero gravity, there was no place to anchor my feet. I had this little handlebar to stand on, a couple bars over here to hold on to, and I had to twist knobs and valves and bring down arms of this big astronaut maneuvering unit. I was going to fly out in space around there, tootling around, jillions of years ago. And now we see it happening on a station, and they use the same golden slippers we use. They use the same tethers we use. They They've certainly improved the spacesuits significantly, so you get the motion and mobility and dexterity we didn't have, but that's a natural evolution of what we were doing. But yeah, I feel pretty good at training. They train exclusively underwater. We didn't do any of that when I went up. We learned, now underwater training is not zero gravity, it's neutral buoyancy. Tremendous help though in giving you an understanding of the environment you're going to be confronted with when you are in zero gravity. And all those things came from the days of the Gemini program, and they started with my flight. The EVA and Apollo on Gemini 10 with Mike Collins pretty much supported the problems I had. Gemini 11 supported the same problems until finally we came to Gemini 12 and said, hey, we're not going to fly the AMU again. Another little incident. If we had, I probably would have flown again because I'm the one who had the experience and probably the know-how to be able to make it successful the second time around. But we didn't. We made what we called a monkey board and had levers and hooks and tethers and made these shoes that you could stand on. And therefore on Gemini 12, Buzz Aldrin it was a piece of cake. But we solved the problems on the ground. We just verified them in space.